A sharp gasp echoed through the grand ballroom. The musicians stopped playing mid-note. Crystal glasses froze halfway to people's lips. More than 300 pairs of eyes turned toward the enormous doors as they slowly swung open. Lady Blanche Fairholme stumbled inside. Her once pristine white engagement gown was covered in mud. Her elegant gloves were torn. One of her shoes was missing. She looked less like a noble bride and more like someone who had just survived a nightmare. The Duchess shot to her feet. "Blanche!" A murmur swept across the ballroom.
What happened to her? Where has she been? She kept the entire kingdom waiting.
This is most irregular.
Blanche's frightened eyes searched the room until they found Lord Horace. For one brief moment, relief washed over her face. She took a trembling step toward him.
Horace, I'm so sorry.
Before she could finish, Horace slowly pulled the engagement ring from his pocket, placed it on the table, looked her straight in the eyes, and said in a voice so cold it silenced the entire ballroom,
Have you finished humiliating me?
A painful silence filled the room. Blanche opened her mouth.
Horace, please let me explain.
But before she could say another word, her father took one slow step forward. The Duke's voice echoed through the ballroom.
Enough. You have kept the most powerful families in the kingdom waiting for over 3 hours. You stand before us dressed like this and expect us to believe you have a good reason?
Blanche's voice trembled.
Father, a woman was dying beside the road. I couldn't leave her.
The room exploded with whispers.
She delayed her own engagement for a beggar? Impossible. She chose a stranger over her own family. How could she? Unthinkable.
The Duke closed his eyes. For a brief moment, he looked less like a father and more like a man terrified of public shame. Then, before the eyes of every noble in attendance, he reached for Blanche's hand, slowly removed the ancient Fairholme family ring, and said the words that shattered her heart forever.
From this moment, you are no longer my daughter.
Blanche didn't scream, she didn't argue, she didn't even try to defend herself again. One tear rolled down her cheek as the only home she had ever known disappeared in a single sentence. But what nobody inside that ballroom knew was that a forgotten old woman lying beside the road would soon change the fate of every person standing there, including the king himself. Before we discover how one act of kindness turned a disowned duke's daughter into the woman who would change an entire kingdom, please take a moment to like this video, subscribe to our channel, and tell us in the comments, where are you watching from today? We'd love to welcome you. Now, let's return to the morning when the entire kingdom believed Lady Blanche Fairholme was about to have the happiest day of her life, unaware that before sunset she would lose her title, her family, and the man she thought she would marry forever. Morning sunlight poured through the towering windows of Fairholme Castle, turning the polished marble floors into rivers of gold. The estate had never been so alive. Servants hurried through endless corridors carrying silver trays, crystal goblets, embroidered tablecloths, towering flower arrangements, and carefully folded invitations. Outside, gardeners clipped the last stray roses, while stable hands brushed magnificent horses until their coats gleamed. Carriages lined the long drive, bringing noble families from every corner of the kingdom. Everywhere one looked, there was excitement. For weeks, newspapers had spoken of only one event, the engagement of the century. Today, Lady Blanche Fairholme would officially become the fiancée of Lord Horace Winfield, heir to one of the wealthiest noble families in the kingdom. Inside the grand entrance hall, Duke Albert Fairholme welcomed each guest personally. His smile never seemed to fade.
Our Blanche has chosen well. Horace is a gentleman of excellent character. We couldn't ask for a finer match. Congratulations, Your Grace. A fine match indeed.
The decorations are exquisite.
The gentlemen congratulated him, while their wives admired the castle's decorations. Nearby, Duchess Victoria stood before a group of noblewomen, carefully unfolding Blanche's engagement gown. The ivory silk shimmered beneath the chandeliers. The lace came from Paris, she said proudly, running gentle fingers across the sleeves. Every stitch was sewn by hand. Blanche deserves nothing less. The ladies gasped in admiration.
It is exquisite. I've never seen
Victoria
anything so
smiled
beautiful.
with quiet satisfaction. Everything had to be perfect. Not simply because her daughter deserved happiness, but because the fair home name deserved admiration. While everyone searched for Blanche, she was nowhere near the ballroom. Instead, she stood in the castle kitchens, laughing with the pastry girls. "Careful," she giggled, as one young maid nearly dropped a tray of sugared pastries. "If those land on the floor, Alfred will tell everyone I ate them before the guests arrived." The nervous girl burst into laughter. "You'd never let me take the blame, my lady." "I certainly wouldn't." Blanche helped arrange the pastries herself before carrying fresh flowers to the dining hall. On her way, she noticed one of the younger maids quietly crying behind a doorway. "What happened?" she asked gently.
My mother's fever returned this morning. I wanted to stay with her, but we're short of servants today.
Blanche gently squeezed her hand.
Finish your duties, then go home early. I'll speak with Alfred. Thank you, ma'am.
Relief flooded the girl's face. "Thank you, my lady." Moments later, Blanche was outside helping the head gardener arrange white roses around the fountain. When she heard shouting from the stables, she hurried across the courtyard. A frightened mare had just given birth, and the tiny foal struggled to stand. The stablemaster looked exhausted. Blanche knelt without hesitation. "There you are," she whispered softly, stroking the trembling animal until it found its balance. The old stablemaster smiled.
I've looked after horses for 40 years, but they always seem calmer when you're nearby.
I think he's simply trying to impress everyone before today's celebration.
The old man chuckled. Word spread quickly through the servants' quarters.
Lady Blanche helped another maid. She was in the kitchens this morning. She even checked on the foal.
One elderly housemaid smiled warmly.
If Lady Blanche becomes mistress of this estate one day, but we shall all grow old smiling.
Oh, how lovely. Indeed, it would be a blessing.
A true
Not
blessing.
long afterward, Alfred the butler found Blanche dusting flower petals from her sleeves. "There you are," he said with a gentle sigh. "I've searched the entire castle." She smiled. "I was helping." "I know." Alfred had watched Blanche grow from a curious little girl into a compassionate young woman. He had taught her how to pour tea without spilling, how to greet visiting nobles, and even how to ride her first pony. Every Christmas, she secretly left a small wrapped gift outside his room, pretending she knew nothing about it. He straightened her
Your
collar.
mother has asked for you at least 5 times.
Then I'd better stop keeping her grace waiting.
Before she reached the entrance hall, another carriage rolled into the courtyard. Lord Horace Winfield stepped out. Tall, elegant, perfectly dressed. His warm smile immediately won over the gathered guests. Duke Albert welcomed him like a son. "It's good to see you, Horace." "The honor is mine, Your Grace." Nearby servants admired how polite he seemed. Then, as Horace crossed the courtyard, a muddy stable boy accidentally brushed against the sleeve of his coat. The boy froze. "I'm terribly sorry, my lord." Horace smiled pleasantly. "Think nothing of it." The frightened child hurried away. Several moments later, after no one seemed to be watching, Horace quietly removed his leather gloves and handed them to his valet. "Dispose of these." Only Blanche noticed. She frowned slightly, but said nothing. Perhaps she had imagined it. As they strolled through the castle gardens together, Horace reached for her hand. "After our marriage," he said, "people will watch everything you do." Blanche smiled softly. "Then I hope they see kindness." Horace chuckled softly. "Kindness is admirable, provided it doesn't embarrass a family." His words lingered longer than his smile. For the first time that day, Blanche felt something she couldn't quite explain. Blanche settled comfortably inside the carriage as it rolled away from Fairholme Castle. Behind her, servants waved happily, while guests continued arriving through the great gates. The castle disappeared little by little as the horses carried her toward what everyone believed would be the happiest day of her life. She looked down at the small bouquet resting on her lap and smiled to herself. Despite the excitement surrounding the engagement, she found herself thinking less about gowns and celebrations and more about the young maid whose mother was ill. She made a mental note to visit them after the ceremony. The coachman glanced through the small window. "We're making good time, milady." "I'm glad," Blanche replied. "Father would never forgive me for arriving late." The old coachman laughed. "Today, half the kingdom is waiting for you." The carriage continued along the quiet country road until the horses suddenly slowed. A short distance ahead, something lay near the roadside. The coachman leaned forward, squinting into the distance. "Oh dear." Blanche looked up. "What is it?" "I believe someone has collapsed." He pulled gently on the reins, bringing the carriage to a halt. Blanche stepped down before he could stop her. Lying beside the road was an elderly woman. Her clothes were worn almost beyond repair. A basket filled with tiny flower bundles had tipped over, scattering white blossoms into the dust. Her breathing was shallow. Her hands trembled uncontrollably. When Blanche knelt beside her, she immediately felt the heat radiating from the woman's forehead. "She's burning with fever," Blanche whispered. Just then, another elegant carriage approached. Its passengers slowed only long enough to look. One richly dressed lady frowned. Someone should remove her before the guests begin traveling this road. Without another glance, the carriage rolled away. Then another followed, and another. Each passed without stopping. Blanche watched them disappear before turning back to the old woman. Mamie slowly opened her eyes. "I'm terribly sorry," she whispered weakly. "I didn't mean to block the road." "You don't need to apologize," Blanche said gently. The coachman stepped closer, anxiety written across his face. "My lady," she looked up. "Hundreds of guests are already waiting." "I know. If we delay much longer, people will begin talking." She remained silent. He hesitated before speaking again. "The Duke will be very upset." Blanche looked once more at the frail woman struggling to breathe. Then she quietly removed her own cloak and wrapped it around Mamie's shoulders. The coachman lowered his head. "My lady, please, we must leave." Blanche met his eyes calmly. "Then leave without me." The old coachman's face filled with disbelief. "I can't abandon you." "Then help me save her." For a brief moment he simply stared at her. Finally he nodded. "Very well." Together they carefully lifted Mamie into the carriage. As they continued toward the nearby village instead of the castle, Mamie looked at Blanche with tired eyes. "Why would a noble lady help someone like me?" Blanche smiled warmly. "Because someone once taught me that kindness isn't reserved for equals." Mamie studied her face for a long moment before quietly looking away. No more words were needed. The village doctor hurried outside as soon as the carriage stopped. "Bring her in quickly." Dr. Abraham examined Mamie carefully while Blanche waited just outside the room. The minutes felt endless. Finally, the doctor stepped into the hallway.
You brought her just in time. Another hour and she would not have survived.
Blanche closed her eyes. A wave of relief washed over her. For the first time that morning, she breathed easily. Back at Fairholme Castle, the atmosphere had begun to change. The musicians had already repeated the same melody twice. Guests whispered behind elegant fans. Some checked the grand clock hanging above the ballroom. Others exchanged curious glances. Duke Albert continued greeting newcomers with forced confidence, though his smile had begun to fade. "I'm sure Blanche will arrive any moment," he assured another guest. Nearby, Duchess Victoria paced quietly near the entrance. She adjusted flowers that didn't need adjusting, straightened decorations that were already perfect, anything to hide her growing concern. Horace stood near the front of the ballroom. Every few moments he removed his pocket watch. Each time, his expression hardened a little more. One elderly noble chuckled. "Perhaps the bride has changed her mind." Several guests laughed politely. Horace didn't. His jaw tightened. He slipped the watch back into his pocket without saying a word. Hours later, Mamie finally opened her eyes again. Her fever had begun to ease. She looked at Blanche sitting beside her bed. "You've missed something important because of me." Blanche smiled. "I can always explain." Mamie reached out and gently squeezed her hand. "Never apologize for arriving late if you arrived where you were truly needed." Those words settled quietly inside Blanche's heart. Outside the small village church, the afternoon bells began to ring. Far away at Fairholme Castle, those same bells echoed across the estate. The engagement ceremony had officially begun. For the first time in the history of the Fairholme family, the bride's chair remained empty. The grand doors of Fairholme Castle slowly opened. Every conversation inside the ballroom came to an abrupt halt. The musicians lowered their instruments. Crystal glasses froze halfway to waiting lips. More than 300 guests turned toward the entrance. Lady Blanche Fairholme stood there alone. The grand white gown that had left the castle that morning was now stained with mud. The delicate lace along the hem had torn against rough stones. Loose strands of golden hair framed a face marked by exhaustion, while faint scratches covered her hands from helping lift Mamie into the carriage. For a brief moment, Blanche believed everything would be all right once she explained. She stepped forward. "I'm sorry I'm late." Before she could say another word, Horace looked at her with eyes colder than she had ever seen. Have you finished humiliating me? The words struck her harder than any slap. She stared in disbelief. Not once had he asked if she had been hurt. Not once had he wondered whether she was safe. His only concern was the shame he believed she had brought upon him. Blanche swallowed hard. There was an elderly woman beside the road. She was terribly ill. The doctor said she would have died if no one stopped. Her voice remained calm despite the fear building inside her. I couldn't leave her there. Instead of understanding, whispers spread through the ballroom. A beggar? She delayed the engagement for a stranger? I've never heard of such foolishness. One noblewoman leaned toward her companion and whispered loud enough for nearby guests to hear. Imagine risking a title for a beggar. Several people nodded in agreement. Blanche looked from one familiar face to another. Not a single person defended her. Even those who had praised her kindness hours earlier avoided meeting her eyes. At the front of the room, Duke Albert slowly descended the marble steps. Every footstep echoed through the silent ballroom. He stopped only a few feet from his daughter. His expression revealed disappointment rather than relief. You kept every noble family in this kingdom waiting. Blanche's eyes filled with tears. Father, please listen. I have listened. You haven't heard what happened. I have heard enough. His voice remained steady, but anger simmered beneath every word. For generations, this family has been respected because we honored our responsibilities. Blanche tried once more. I only wanted to save her life. Albert looked around the crowded ballroom. He saw hundreds of watching eyes. He imagined tomorrow's newspapers. He imagined the gossip spreading across the kingdom. His pride defeated his love. Slowly he reached for Blanche's left hand. She looked down in confusion. Without another word, he removed the ancient Fairholme signet ring that had belonged to daughters of their family for generations. The room fell into complete silence. Albert closed his hand around the ring. Then he spoke the words Blanche would remember for the rest of her life. From this day forward, he paused, you carry neither my name nor my protection. Blanche felt as though the floor had disappeared beneath her. She searched desperately for her mother's face. Victoria stood frozen beside the engagement table. Tears streamed silently down her cheeks. She wanted to speak. She wanted to run to her daughter. Instead, she slowly stepped forward with trembling hands. Around Blanche's neck rested a sapphire necklace that had been passed from mother to daughter for generations. Victoria gently unclasped it. Her fingers shook so badly she almost dropped it. I'm sorry, she whispered so quietly only Blanche could hear. Blanche never resisted. She simply lowered her head. Sometimes silence carries more pain than any argument. Horace approached next. His expression remained perfectly composed. He extended his hand, the engagement ring. Blanche looked at the diamond resting on her finger. Just yesterday it had symbolized a future. Today it meant nothing. Without protest, she removed it and placed it into Horace's palm. He slipped it into his pocket before saying quietly,
Perhaps you truly belong among the people you chose.
Those words finally shattered the last piece of Blanche's heart. She realized she had never truly known the man standing before her. Unable to bear another moment inside the ballroom, she turned toward the doors. No one stopped her. No one called her name. No one followed. As she reached the entrance hall, Alfred quietly appeared from the shadows. His eyes were red. Without speaking, he pressed a small leather purse into her hands. Blanche looked at him in surprise. Inside was enough coins to survive several weeks. Alfred gently closed her fingers around it. A house may close its doors, his voice trembled, but heaven never closes its heart. At last, Blanche could no longer hold back her tears. She embraced the old butler who had loved her like her own child. "Thank you," she whispered through her sobs. Alfred watched helplessly as she walked out of the castle gates with nothing except the clothes she wore and the small purse hidden beneath her cloak. Darkness had already begun to settle across the countryside. She had no destination, no family, no home. Hours later, the castle had grown quiet. Guests had departed. The decorations remained untouched, reminders of a celebration that had never happened. Unable to sleep, Duke Albert wandered through the silent corridors until he found himself standing outside Blanche's bedroom. He slowly opened the door. Everything remained exactly as she had left it. Books rested neatly on the shelves. Fresh flowers still stood by the window. Her favorite shawl lay folded across a chair. On her bedside table sat a faded birthday card she had made for him when she was only 6 years old. In childish handwriting it read, "To the best father in the whole world, I will always make you proud." Albert sat heavily on the edge of her bed. For the first time that day, he cried. But even then, his pride still whispered that he had done the right thing. Meanwhile, outside the castle gates, Blanche stood alone under the evening sky. She wrapped her arms around herself against the cold. Then a familiar voice called softly behind her, "Come home with me." Blanche turned. Mamie stood beside the carriage. She had not said, "Come to my house." She had said, "Come home." Blanche had spent her entire life inside one of the grandest castles in the kingdom. She knew how to greet kings. She knew which fork belonged beside each plate at a royal banquet. She could dance every formal dance without missing a single step. But on her very first morning inside Mamie's tiny cottage, she discovered she didn't know how to light a stove. Mamie watched with folded arms as Blanche struck 2 pieces of flint together for what felt like the 20th time. Nothing happened. Blanche frowned. "I think the stove dislikes me." Mamie smiled. "The stove doesn't know you're a lady." After several more attempts, a tiny spark finally caught. Blanche leaned closer to celebrate. A puff of smoke burst into her face, covering the tip of her nose with soot. Mamie laughed so hard she had to hold on to the table. When Blanche caught her reflection in the kettle, she laughed too. It was the first genuine laugh she had shared since leaving the castle. Cooking proved no easier. She sliced vegetables so unevenly that some pieces were enormous, while others nearly disappeared. Trying to knead bread only made flour explode across the kitchen. By lunchtime, both women looked as though they had been caught in a snowstorm. A group of village children peered through the open window. One little boy giggled. "Miss Blanche!" She looked up. "I think the bread is winning." The children burst into laughter. Blanche looked down at the shapeless lump sitting on the table and laughed along with them. "You may be right." Mamie eventually rescued what remained of the dough. Even the finest baker once burned his first loaf. Over the following days, Blanche learned how different ordinary life truly was. Water did not appear with the ringing of a bell. Someone had to fetch it. Clothes did not return neatly folded after being worn. Someone had to wash them. Meals required planning because food was precious. Every coin mattered, every loaf mattered, every neighbor mattered. Each evening, after supper, Mamie brewed a pot of tea. The two women would sit outside the cottage, beneath the old oak tree, while the village slowly settled into silence. Those evenings became Blanche's favorite part of every day. One night, Mamie placed a torn shirt into Blanche's lap. "Today," she said, "you'll learn how to mend clothes." Blanche examined the needle uncertainly. "I've never held one before." "I know." Mamie patiently guided her hands until the stitches became straighter.
The strongest things are often the ones repaired with care.
Another evening, Mamie divided a simple loaf of bread into several smaller pieces. Blanche looked puzzled. "There are only two of us." Mamie smiled. "Mrs. Ellis lost her husband last winter." She placed one piece into a basket. "Mr. Cooper has been ill all week." Another joined the first. "The twins next door are growing faster than their mother can feed them." Soon, most of the bread had disappeared. Blanche looked at the tiny piece left behind. "And what about us?" Mamie smiled peacefully. "We've never gone hungry after feeding someone else." Blanche carried the baskets through the village herself. She saw gratitude that no grand banquet had ever shown her. Slowly, she began understanding something the castle had never taught. Generosity was not measured by how much someone owned. It was measured by what they were willing to share. One evening, she asked Mamie quietly, "Why are some people so cruel?" Mamie looked toward the setting sun before answering. "Loneliness can harden a heart if it stays there too long." Blanche thought about her father. Mamie continued, "And revenge only keeps that loneliness alive. So forgiveness is better. It doesn't erase pain, it simply stops pain from choosing your future." Those words stayed with Blanche. Several weeks later, excitement spread through the village. The old wooden bridge crossing the stream had finally become unsafe. The villagers gathered with timber and tools to rebuild it before autumn rains arrived. Blanche joined them without hesitation. As she struggled to lift one heavy beam, another pair of hands reached for the opposite end. "Perhaps we should carry it together," a cheerful voice suggested. She looked up. The young man smiled warmly. He wore simple traveling clothes and sturdy boots covered with dust. There was nothing about him that suggested wealth or importance. "I'm Arthur," he said. "Blanche." "Nice to meet you, Blanche." Together they carried the timber across the bridge while chatting easily. Arthur greeted every villager as though they had known each other for years. He helped elderly men lift stones. He repaired broken fence posts without being asked. When children needed shorter pieces of wood, he knelt beside them and showed them how to measure safely before cutting. Within an hour, everyone liked him. Then disaster struck. Mamie's stubborn white goose came charging across the field with its wings spread wide. Arthur looked over his shoulder. "Is that bird running toward me?" Before anyone answered, the goose chased him across the bridge. Arthur dropped his hammer and ran. The children laughed so hard they could barely breathe. Even the old carpenter wiped tears from his eyes. Arthur finally climbed onto a wooden cart to escape. "I surrender," he announced. "The bridge belongs to the goose." Blanche laughed until her cheeks hurt. She hadn't realized how much she had missed laughing. Late that afternoon, hidden among a line of distant trees overlooking the village, Duke Albert sat quietly on horseback. He had told no one where he was going. From where he stood, he watched Blanche sharing bread with laughing children before joining Arthur and the villagers to finish repairing the bridge. She looked tired. Her dress was simple. Her hands were rougher than before, yet her smile seemed brighter than any he remembered. Albert lowered his eyes. "She smiles more here than she ever did in my palace," he whispered to himself. For the first time, doubt crept into his heart. As the sun disappeared beyond the hills, Blanche and Arthur stood talking beside the completed bridge while the villagers celebrated their work. From her porch, Mamie quietly watched them. She wrapped her shawl around her shoulders and smiled to herself. She said nothing. Some futures were far too beautiful to disturb before their time. Nearly a year had passed since Blanche walked away from Fairholme Castle with nothing but the clothes on her back and Elfred's small purse hidden beneath her cloak. Life in the village no longer felt unfamiliar. Each morning before the church bell rang, children gathered beneath the old oak tree, carrying worn books and tiny slates tucked beneath their arms. The moment Blanche appeared, they rushed toward her. "Miss Blanche, are we reading another story today? Will you teach us the new words you promised?" She smiled as they settled into the grass. "We'll do both." Patiently, she guided tiny fingers across faded pages, helping each child sound out words they had never learned to read before. She celebrated every small success as though it were the greatest achievement in the world. When lessons ended, she closed each book carefully. "Now go home before your mothers think I've stolen you." The children laughed and raced across the fields. Her afternoons belonged to Mamie. Together, they carried baskets filled with soup, bread, and vegetables from cottage to cottage. Mrs. Ellis had weak knees. Old Mr. Cooper still struggled to breathe after his winter illness. The twins next door never seemed to stop growing. Blanche knew every family by name. She knew whose roof leaked whenever it rained. She knew who secretly left firewood outside lonely neighbors' doors. For the first time in her life, she belonged to a community that expected nothing from her except kindness. Each evening after supper, she and Mamie shared tea outside the cottage while the sun disappeared beyond the hills. Those quiet conversations became Blanche's greatest education. One evening, Mamie held up a single loaf of bread. "If 8 hungry people knock on your door, what do you do?" she asked. Blanche smiled. "Cut smaller slices." Mamie nodded proudly. "A full stomach feeds the body. A shared meal feeds the heart." On another evening, Blanche asked, "Why do people with so little always seem to give so much?" Mamie stirred her tea before answering. "Because they remember what it feels like to have nothing." Blanche lowered her eyes thoughtfully. The old woman continued, "Pride tells us to protect what belongs to us. What does humility say? It reminds us that nothing truly belongs to us forever." Those simple conversations slowly changed the way Blanche saw the world. One bright morning, familiar laughter echoed from the village square. Arthur had returned. Nobody knew where he traveled between visits. Nobody asked. He simply appeared with the sunrise, as though he had always belonged there. Within minutes, he was helping repair a widow's broken roof. Later, he carried heavy sacks of grain into the mill, before spending the afternoon fixing loose fence posts for an elderly farmer whose back no longer allowed such work. Whenever someone thanked him, Arthur only smiled. We all need help sometimes. He never accepted payment. The villagers simply assumed he was a wandering gentleman who enjoyed honest work. Blanche found herself smiling whenever she saw him. Their friendship had become effortless. Sometimes they worked together in comfortable silence. Other times they talked for hours while gathering vegetables or walking children home after lessons. Arthur remembered everything she told him. If Blanche once mentioned that a widow preferred apple tea instead of mint, he remembered. If she admired wildflowers blooming beside the river, he quietly picked a small bouquet the next time he passed. His kindness never demanded attention. It simply appeared. One afternoon, Blanche struggled to balance on the old stool while trying to repair Mamie's broken window. Without saying a word, Arthur steadied the ladder from below until she finished. Only afterwards did she realize what he had done. "You could have said something. I didn't want you to lose your concentration." She smiled. "Thank you." It wasn't much, but to Blanche, it meant everything. Of course, no visit from Arthur ever remained peaceful for long. The moment Mamie's white goose spotted him, it lowered its head and charged. "Not again," Arthur groaned. Children immediately abandoned their games to watch the daily chase. Arthur sprinted around the well with the goose close behind. "I've done nothing to offend you." The goose answered by flapping its wings furiously. Arthur finally escaped by climbing onto an empty wagon. Breathing heavily, he looked down at the furious bird. "One day," he sighed dramatically, "that goose will inherit the kingdom." The children collapsed into fits of laughter. Even Mamie covered her smile with her apron. Blanche laughed so hard, tears filled her eyes. Meanwhile, far from the peaceful village, Horace Winfield's life had taken a very different direction. His engagement to Lady Celeste Ashcombe had become the talk of high society. Celeste came from one of the richest noble families in the kingdom. At first, Horace considered himself fortunate. Then reality settled in. Nothing he did pleased her. She criticized his clothes before important dinners, corrected his opinions in front of guests, demanded expensive jewelry as though affection could be purchased. Whenever he attempted conversation, she reminded him that her family's fortune exceeded his own. One evening she casually remarked, "I do hope marriage improves your manners." Several nobles overheard her. Embarrassed laughter spread through the room. For the first time, Horace remembered Blanche defending him whenever others joked at his expense. He suddenly realized how gentle she had always been. Regret arrived quietly and refused to leave. Not far away, Duke Elbert once again rode alone toward the village. Hidden behind a line of tall trees, he watched Blanche sharing bread with laughing children, while Arthur repaired a broken cart nearby. She looked happier than he had ever seen her. Albert lowered his head. "She smiles more here," he whispered sadly, "than she ever smiled in my home." He allowed himself to ask the question he had spent months avoiding. Had protecting his family's honor cost him the daughter he loved most? Days later, Arthur failed to appear. Blanche expected him the next morning, then the next. A week passed, then another. Every afternoon she found herself glancing toward the road leading into the village. She never spoke his name. She never admitted what she was feeling. But deep inside, she had begun missing the gentleman with no title. A little more than 2 weeks had passed since Arthur disappeared without a word. Blanche never asked anyone where he had gone. She simply continued teaching the village children each morning, helping Mamie each afternoon, and pretending she wasn't looking toward the road each evening. Then, one bright morning, a familiar voice interrupted her lesson. "I believe I owe someone an apology." The children turned first. "Arthur!" Before Blanche could even stand, 6 children had already surrounded him. "You disappeared. You missed the fishing contest." The goose looked disappointed. Arthur laughed as he greeted each child, before finally looking at Blanche. "I'm sorry." She smiled gently. "You don't have to explain. I had family duties." He spoke the words carefully, offering nothing more. For a brief moment, Blanche wondered what kind of family required someone to vanish without warning. Then she remembered Mamie's advice. Trust is not built by demanding answers. It is built by giving them time. She simply nodded. "I'm glad you're back." Arthur smiled with visible relief. "So am I." A few days later, the entire village gathered for its annual harvest festival. Colorful ribbons hung between cottages. Long wooden tables overflowed with fresh bread, roasted vegetables, pies, and fruit. Children chased one another across the square, while musicians filled the afternoon with cheerful melodies. Mamie watched the celebration with a mischievous smile. Without telling either of them, she quietly entered Blanche and Arthur into nearly every competition. The first was a 3-legged race. When Blanche discovered their names on the list, she looked at Arthur. "You knew about this?" He laughed. "I thought you did." The race began. Neither of them managed more than 3 steps before falling into a pile of hay. The crowd burst into laughter. Even Blanche couldn't stop laughing as Arthur struggled to untie the ribbon binding their legs together. "I believe we've already lost." "I think we lost 5 seconds ago," Blanche replied. Their next challenge wasn't any better. During the pie baking contest, Arthur accidentally added salt instead of sugar. One bite was enough to convince the judges to quietly move their pie away from the others. The children teased him for the rest of the afternoon. Archery proved even worse. Arthur completely missed the target. Blanche somehow hit the wooden fence instead. The old carpenter jokingly thanked her for creating extra repair work. Even the wood-chopping contest ended in disaster after Arthur's axe became stuck halfway through a log. By sunset, they had failed almost every event. Oddly enough, neither of them cared. Arthur laughed louder than anyone. Winning had never been the reason he came. As evening settled over the village, the music slowed. Couples gathered beneath glowing lanterns for the final dance. Arthur approached Blanche. "Would you like to?" She smiled. "I should warn you, I'm not very graceful. I've seen your archery." She laughed. "That bad?" "Worse." They danced anyway. Neither of them noticed Mamie quietly watching from her porch. Later that night, Arthur helped Mamie carry empty baskets back into the cottage. Before he left, she stopped him. "You care about her." Arthur didn't answer. He simply smiled. Mamie nodded knowingly. "Then remember something." Arthur waited. "Never ask a woman to choose between love and kindness." She looked toward the doorway where
Never
Blanche
ask
was
a woman
washing
to choose
teacups.
between love and
If she
kindness.
chooses love,
If
you
she
may
chooses
lose her.
kindness,
But if she
you have
chooses
found your
kindness,
wife.
you have
I'll
found your
remember.
wife. Arthur remained silent for several moments. "I'll remember." Far away, Duke Albert spent another sleepless night. The weight of his decision had followed him every day since Blanche left the castle. Finally, unable to bear it any longer, he rode back to the village. This time, he didn't hide. Blanche had just finished reading with several children when she noticed him standing near the old oak tree. The children quietly stepped aside. Albert removed his hat. For a long moment, neither of them spoke. Finally, Blanche walked toward him. She offered a respectful bow. "Good afternoon." She hesitated only briefly. "Your Grace." The words struck Albert harder than any accusation. Not father, not papa, only the formal title she once used for strangers. He opened his mouth to speak. No words came. His eyes filled with tears. After a long silence, he simply nodded, then turned his horse around and rode away. Blanche watched until he disappeared beyond the hill. Meanwhile, Horace's carefully planned future was collapsing. Lady Celeste Ashcombe had grown tired of pretending. During a royal banquet attended by some of the kingdom's most powerful nobles, she interrupted Horace repeatedly, mocked his opinions, and laughed openly when he stumbled during a formal toast. Finally, she placed her engagement ring on the table. "I refuse to marry a man so easily impressed by himself." Without another glance, she walked away. The banquet fell silent. By morning, every noble household knew what had happened. Soon people began whispering something Horace never expected to hear. Perhaps Lady Blanche was never the problem. His reputation crumbled almost as quickly as his engagement. Weeks later, driven by regret more than hope, Horace travelled to the village. He imagined finding Blanche lonely and miserable. Instead, he found children surrounding her beneath the oak tree. Mamie laughed while Arthur repaired a broken wheel nearby. Neighbours greeted Blanche with warm smiles. She belonged there. She looked happier than she ever had beside him. For the first time, Horace understood exactly what he had thrown away. When the lesson ended, he quietly approached her. "Blanche." She turned calmly. "I've come to ask something." She waited. "Can you ever forgive me?" A gentle smile appeared on her face. "I forgave you long ago." Hope flickered in his eyes. Then she softly continued, "That doesn't mean we belong together." Horace lowered his head. There was nothing left to say. At that very moment, the sound of galloping horses echoed through the village. Royal soldiers rode into the square, wearing the king's colours. The captain dismounted immediately. Without hesitation, he walked straight toward Arthur. Then, before the stunned villagers, he dropped to one knee. Every soldier behind him did the same. The entire village stood frozen in silence.
The entire village stood frozen. The royal captain remained on one knee before Arthur. Behind him, nearly 20 royal guards lowered their heads in perfect silence. Even the horses stood motionless. Children stopped laughing. The village square, usually filled with cheerful voices, became so quiet that the wind could be heard rustling the leaves above them. The captain finally spoke. "Your Royal Highness." He lowered his head even further. "His Majesty requests your immediate return to the palace." No one moved. No one breathed. Blanche looked from the kneeling soldiers to Arthur, hoping someone would explain what she had just heard. Arthur closed his eyes for a brief moment before looking back at her. "I'm sorry." Those two words confirmed everything. He wasn't an ordinary traveler. He wasn't a wandering gentleman. He was the crown prince, the future king. A little boy tugged gently on Blanche's sleeve. "Miss
Miss
Blanche,"
Blanche,
his
does
tiny
that mean
voice
Arthur is
trembled.
really a prince?
"Does that mean Arthur is really a prince?" Blanche couldn't answer. She was still trying to understand how the man who repaired broken fences, carried grain for elderly farmers, and spent every afternoon running from Mammy's goose had been the heir to the throne all along. Arthur slowly stepped toward her. "I wanted to tell you." She searched his face. "Then why didn't you?" "Because I wanted you to know me." He paused. "Before you knew my title." Blanche lowered her eyes. For the first time since meeting Arthur, she didn't know what to say. While everyone struggled to understand the truth, Mammy quietly picked up her basket of flowers as though nothing unusual had happened. Blanche turned toward her. "You already knew?" Mammy smiled gently. "Since the day he first walked into this village." Arthur
You
looked at her
recognized
with
me.
surprise. "You
I
recognized
recognized
me?"
the little boy
"I
whose cradle I
recognized the
once
little boy
rocked."
whose cradle I once rocked." Before either of them could ask another question, Mammy simply chuckled. "Some stories are better told at the right time." Then she walked back toward her
Some
cottage,
stories
leaving
are better
everyone
told
even
at the
more
right
curious
time.
than before. Arthur looked at Blanche once more. "I have to go." She nodded quietly. "I understand. I don't know how long I'll be gone. I'll pray for your safe return." Arthur wanted to say something more. Instead, he simply bowed his head before mounting his horse. As the royal procession disappeared down the road, Blanche stood watching until the last banner vanished beyond the hills. For the first time since losing her family, she feared losing someone else. 2 days later, Arthur arrived at the royal palace. King Henry was already waiting inside the private council chamber. The king embraced his son warmly before stepping back. "You've changed." Arthur smiled. "I hope for the better." The king noticed the sun-darkened skin, the calloused hands, and the simple clothes Arthur still wore. "You've lived among my people." "I have." "Were the journey and the disguise worth it?" Arthur didn't hesitate. "They taught me more than 20 years inside this palace ever could." For the rest of the afternoon, Arthur told his father everything. He described the tiny village where strangers shared food before feeding themselves. He spoke about Mammy's wisdom. He explained how Blanche had sacrificed her engagement to save an elderly woman abandoned beside the road. He told how she accepted poverty without bitterness, how she taught children to read, how she cared for neighbors who could offer nothing in return, and how she never once complained about everything she had lost. The king's expression gradually changed. At first, he listened with curiosity, then admiration, finally anger, not toward Blanche, toward those who punished compassion. King Henry slowly stood from his chair. "So," he said quietly, "a duke cast aside his own daughter because she chose mercy over pride." Arthur nodded. "A nobleman abandoned the woman he claimed to love because she arrived late after saving a life." Arthur nodded again. The king walked toward the palace window. "What kind of kingdom have I allowed to grow when kindness is treated like disgrace?" He turned sharply toward his chief steward. "Send royal summons immediately." The steward bowed. "To whom, Your Majesty?" "To every family connected to this matter." His voice echoed through the chamber. "Duke Albert Fairholme, Lord Horace Winfield, their households, and every noble who witnessed that engagement. They will appear before the royal court. Attendance is not optional." By sunset, royal messengers were riding across the kingdom, carrying sealed invitations bearing the king's crest. When Duke Albert received his summons, his hands began shaking before he had even broken the seal. He read the king's command once, then again. He already knew why he had been called. That night, sleep never came. He wandered through Blanche's empty bedroom until dawn, staring at the childhood drawings she had once hung on the walls.
For the first time, he admitted the truth to himself. He had not protected his family, he had destroyed it. Across the kingdom, Horace reacted very differently. After reading the royal summons, a proud smile slowly spread across his face. His closest friend looked confused. "You seem pleased." Horace folded the letter carefully. "The king has heard everything. And he'll realize Blanche and I belong together." His friend frowned. "After all that happened?" Horace laughed confidently. What better husband could a future queen possibly need than the man she was originally promised to? Blinded by pride one final time, he mistook a royal summons for a reward. Days later, magnificent carriages filled the roads leading toward the capital. Dukes, earls, lords, ladies, every noble family invited by the king entered the palace through its towering gates. None of them knew what judgment awaited inside. None of them realized their lives were about to change forever.
The royal court had never been so quiet. Powerful dukes stood shoulder to shoulder with wealthy earls. Ladies dressed in jewels whispered behind folded fans. Royal advisers lined the walls, while soldiers guarded every entrance. No one spoke above a whisper. Everyone waited for the king. At the front of the hall stood Duke Albert with his head lowered. Beside him, Duchess Victoria clutched a handkerchief tightly. Horace stood a few steps away, dressed in his finest clothes, still foolishly believing the king's summons would somehow restore the future he had lost. Then the great doors opened. A royal herald announced, "His Majesty, King Henry." Every noble bowed. King Henry entered with Crown Prince Arthur beside him. Blanche stood quietly near Mummy, wearing a simple blue gown instead of expensive jewels. The king walked past the dukes, past the earls, past every noble waiting to greet him. Without slowing down, he stopped in front of Mummy. Then, before the entire royal court, the king slowly lowered himself onto one knee. A gasp swept across the ballroom. Several ladies covered their mouths. Even Duke Albert looked stunned. The king gently took Mummy's hands. "My kingdom still stands because of you." Silence filled the room. The king slowly rose and turned toward the assembled nobles. 40 years ago, he began, my parents were attacked while traveling through the countryside. The royal carriage overturned during a violent storm. The assassins believed no one had survived. He looked back at Mammy, but one woman stopped. She hid the king, the queen, and their infant son inside her tiny cottage for 3 days. She shared her last loaf of bread. She risked her own life. When the danger had passed, she refused gold. She refused land. She refused every honor offered to her. Then she quietly disappeared. The entire court stared at Mammy in disbelief. Arthur stepped beside her. "I was that child." Mammy smiled warmly. "I recognized you the moment you arrived in my village." Arthur touched the small birthmark behind his ear. "The same birthmark." Mammy nodded. "You've had it since the day you were born." Suddenly, every smile she had given Arthur finally made sense. King Henry slowly faced Duke Albert. His voice remained calm. "When your daughter chose compassion over ceremony," he paused, "what crime did she commit?" No one answered. Not a single noble could defend what had happened. The silence became heavier than any accusation. Albert stepped forward. His proud shoulders no longer carried the confidence of a powerful duke, only the sorrow of a broken father. Then, to everyone's astonishment, he knelt before Blanche, not because the king ordered him, because his heart finally did. His voice trembled. "I protected my name," he looked into her daughter's tear-filled eyes, "and lost my daughter. I spent months convincing myself I had done the right thing. I was wrong. If forgiveness is impossible, I understand." No one inside the ballroom moved. Blanche felt tears gathering once again. She wanted to answer, but the wound was still too fresh. She quietly lowered her eyes. King Henry now turned toward Horace. "Do you have anything to say?"
Horace stepped forward confidently. "Your Majesty, I only acted as any honorable gentleman would. A noble family cannot ignore—" Arthur calmly interrupted him. "You valued titles more than character." The room fell silent again. "You mistook kindness for weakness. You cared more about arriving on time than saving a dying woman." Arthur's voice never rose. "Such a man cannot stand near the future throne." King Henry lifted his hand. "It is my judgment. Lord Horace Winfield is stripped of every royal appointment. He shall no longer advise this crown. His family shall lose every honorary position granted by the palace. He will receive no invitation to future royal ceremonies. The estates of his family shall remain, but respect," the king looked directly into Horace's eyes, "must now be earned." For the first time in his life, Horace realized wealth could not buy honor. He slowly lowered his head. He had thrown away the woman every man in the kingdom would soon admire. Then Arthur walked toward Blanche. He stopped only a few feet away. Without hesitation, the crown prince knelt before her. The entire court watched in complete silence. Arthur smiled softly. "I didn't fall in love with a duke's daughter. I fell in love with a woman who stopped beside the road when everyone else rode past." He opened a small velvet box. Inside rested a simple engagement ring, not covered in enormous jewels, elegant, beautiful, just like the woman standing before him. "Lady Blanche Fairholme, will you marry me?" Tears rolled gently down Blanche's cheeks. This time they were tears of joy. She smiled through them. "Yes." The royal court erupted into applause. Several weeks later, peace returned to the little village. Nami had grown weaker. One quiet evening, Blanche, Arthur, Duke Albert, and Duchess Victoria gathered beside her bed. Nami looked at each of them with peaceful eyes. Then she smiled. "Remember, a kingdom is not measured by its castles. It is measured by how it treats the person everyone else walks past." She gently closed her eyes and slipped peacefully into eternity. At her funeral, hundreds of villagers came to honor the woman who had changed all their lives. Duke Albert refused the seat prepared for him. Instead, he quietly served bread and warm soup to every guest who attended. No speeches, no titles, only humble service. Blanche watched from a distance, not for a single day, but for many months. She watched her father rebuild cottages, visit lonely villagers, and quietly help those in need without seeking praise. Only then did she walk toward him. He looked up. Her voice was barely above a whisper. "Father." Albert covered his face as tears finally overcame him. The daughter he thought he had lost forever had come home. Months later, Arthur and Blanche were married in the same little village where their story truly began. Villagers filled the front rows. Nobles gladly sat behind them. Duke Albert proudly walked his daughter down the aisle, not as the kingdom's most powerful duke, but as a grateful father given a second chance. As Arthur and Blanche exchanged their vows, Mammy's stubborn white goose wandered into the celebration, stole a fresh bread roll from the royal chef, and chased him across the village square. Laughter echoed through the crowd. Even King Henry laughed. And as the bells rang across the village, everyone understood a simple truth. Blanche had stopped beside a lonely road to save one forgotten woman. She never imagined that single act of kindness would restore a broken family, humble the proud, inspire a king, reveal a prince, and lead her to become the future queen, not because of the title she inherited, but because of the compassion she chose.